So now let's talk a little bit about racism. Racism has become like the automatic explanation for everything in the United States. And I mean, not just in the United States, other people also automatically assume that it's racism, the reason why there are so many disparities. But we can see, I mean, obviously the book centers more in the United States, but even nowadays we can at least listen or more from Americans how they complain about this. However, the dangers of automatically assuming that it's racism, it's like the extent in which this belief it is accepted without even putting it to empirical tests, to subject it to evidence and logic, because then we reach conclusions that won't help anyone. Then another huge danger that is more than clear nowadays, at least for some of us, is that it's how intolerant they are when people show evidence that it's opposite to what they believe, or that it's a counter argument to the arguments that they are giving. They become intolerant and violent, and they just want to censor everyone that is against it. One of the biggest fallacies they do is the ad hominem, because it's easier. These are dangers to the basic functioning of a free society, which is of fallible human beings. Now I will be talking about statistics. However, obviously, if you want to go into even more detail, which is more than possible, everything is in the book. But let's start with the fact that not because there are disparities in between races, it means that it's due to race. I mean, I have mentioned some of the factors before, but let's go into more specific examples. For example, in the United States, the median of the black family income has been lower than the median of the white family. The magnitude of this difference hasn't been 2 to 1 since 1947. And however, one addition to this statistic is that the difference per capita between Asian Americans to Mexican Americans is more than twice. So Asians earn more than twice than Mexicans. However, you can also see that Asian Americans earn more than whites, which is one of the details that people tend to overlook is when they are looking at the statistics of black and whites, they fail to also see statistics of other races. And this doesn't mean that, I mean, Asian Americans are a minority in the United States. Yet they earn more, and it doesn't mean that they are oppressing the rest of the population. But it's also, there is one more detail to this, and it's also to take in consideration the age of the people, because at different ages you earn more or less. You know, the younger you are, obviously your income is gonna be lesser because you don't have that much experience. So again, it's one other factor that we have to take in consideration when we are reading statistics, or where people just throw at us statistics. Okay, so for example, the different countries have different median age. Germany, Italy, and who else? And Japan have a median age of 40 compared to Afghanistan, Angola, Nigeria, where they have a medium age below 20. So we can assume that, or we can interpret it as it makes sense that these nations uh, have more accumulative income because the average person has worked more, whereas these ones that the average person is just starting to enter the workforce. Um, in addition to this, for example, white female-headed single parent have had a poverty rate more than double than married black couples in the years from 1994 to 2020. And as Sowell said it in the book, is like, does this mean that racists are only racist towards single black and not when they are married? Different factors affect how we read the statistics. There was a census in 2020 that showed that more than 9 million black Americans had a higher income than the average white American. So I will read this part. Since 1994, the annual poverty rate of black married couples Americans hasn't been as high as 10%, and in no year in more than half a century has the national poverty of Americans as a whole been as low as 10%. So it just adds to the information that maybe these disparities are not entirely about race or racism. And we can see this because there are also disparities within these same groups. So in the United States, for example, they have like these two types of schools, the charter public schools and the traditional public schools. And they study, or they took a look about this particular group of Hispanic and Black, where these two schools were in the same building. And when they had to take the mathematics test to see the proficiency, the ones in the charter schools were 6 times as often as reaching this proficiency level than compared to the traditional public schools. And this is within the same races. It had nothing to do with race. It had more to do with the schools. So this difference in proportions don't necessarily mean that it's due to race. It can be because of the single or dual parents that are in the household, due to the age or due to the education. So it's not the wisest thing to jump to conclusions. A Census Bureau study found that Owsley County was the lowest income county in any American state in 2014. And why is this relevant? It's because this county is 99% white. The New York Times Magazine rated different counties in the United States in 2014. And 6 out of 10 were in eastern Kentucky, and the population there, it was 90% white. So again, it's just like, it doesn't mean that it's not the differences, it's just about race. It can be also like the location in which these groups of people are. During 1969 to 2020, there were different studies of these same counties, and they found a very similar pattern in the income. They were consistently below the Black Americans' households nationwide. And one may ask, like, okay, then what is this about? Just like we don't want to jump into the conclusion that whites are oppressing black, we don't want to jump into the conclusion that blacks are oppressing white. One of the reasons is because people living in mountains and foothills, or as Americans like to call it, hillbillies, they usually lag economically and social development because they are further away from others. in these areas, there is like it tends to be like a higher dropouts from high schools and lower graduates from colleges. So this is an important factor to take in consideration. And just like he said, it's like none of this automatically tells us how much effect discrimination has or any other factor of, of the given group's economics or other advancement. If anything, it's just that history has taught us to not jump into conclusions because, again, there are different factors to take in consideration. It is wrongly assumed that the legacy of slavery is correlated to higher incidence of children born to unmarried Black women. The reason for this is because more than a century after slavery ended, the vast majority of Black children were born to married couples. In the 1960s, born children to unmarried Black women rose 23.6% compared to 16.8% from 1940. However, this wasn't only a Black women issue, since the births of unmarried white women also rose during the 60s. This upturn of the races, it was due to the expansion of the welfare during the 60s. So it was like this new pattern has persisted, which tells us that similar outcomes can come from similar behavioral patterns that differ from race. So other disparities in outcomes can be for different behavioral patterns, where we just added one more factor that can affect statistics. The people that love to talk and to be alarmed for these big disparities between Black and white, and they tend to ignore or to show no interest at all in Asian statistics, because for some reason only Black and white disparities matter. And there is this other misconception that Black are the last to hire and the first one to fire. But again, no one takes in consideration that white employees are fired before Asian ones. And this can be for several reasons, because we could have to take in consideration the level in the company that these people were. Because obviously you're as a company, in order to succeed, you're gonna see where you have to cut people. It can vary from different departments and all kinds of different factors that a company has to contemplate in order to keep alive. And as Thomas Sowell's questions or asked is, are we to accept statistical data as evidence when these data fit existing preconceptions, but not accept such data when they go counter to those same preconceptions? And this will bring us to real racism, to what actually happened in the past in the United States, which was genetic determinism. Progressivism was a major new force among Americans at the time, and these American intellectuals were advocating for genetic determinism because they believed that less successful races were genetically inferior. So as we are seeing, this took an opposite conclusion, opposite views on racial issues, because they just went with the preconceptions that they had and jumped to conclusions. So whereas before this disparity in races was due to genetic determinism, Now it is due to victims of racism. And as he said, it is like the conclusions were different, but the way evidence was used and the way contrary views and contrary evidence were disregarded was very similar. How the progressives at the time reached such conclusions was through IQ tests. One of the ways they would measure intelligence, it was with the soldiers in the US Army. And they were given mental tests to, during the First World War. 100,000 tests were given, and as a whole, the black soldiers had a lower score than the white ones, and they went with that. It was like, see, here is the test. They are not. They are way below the white ones, therefore they are inferior. Did they care to look a little bit closer? No, but Sowell did. Well, he showed it in this book. And what he says is like, when there is an internal breakdown of this same test, you can see how blacks from Ohio, Illinois, New York, and Pennsylvania scored higher than the white soldiers from Georgia, Arkansas, Kentucky, and Mississippi, which these latter ones are in the South. And because at the time there was racism, the white people in the South, they didn't want blacks to get any education. So that is one of the reasons the blacks from the South were scoring lower than the white ones. And blacks living in the North had higher IQs than the black ones in the South, because we're seeing one more factor, which is education. And some of the questions that there were in this USA Army were the color of sapphire, the location of Cornell University, the profession of Alfred Noyes, the city in which Pierce Arrow automobile was manufactured. Super random questions, because just as Sowell said, it's like, why would the Black American have this knowledge, or recent immigrants? Because that's another thing they were saying at the time, or they were using as evidence at the time. It was to say that because Jews were also taking the test, there were like Eastern European Jews immigrants, and they were taking this test, and the score was lower than the average. So then they were saying like, see, the Jews are not as intelligent as people think they are. But looking at these questions, it's like, why would blacks or recent immigrants had this knowledge if it's not relevant to your life? And as he said, as Thomas Sowell says it, is like, and why would these questions were selected to measure the innate intellect of a person? It's a complete puzzle. And one more factor to take in consideration is that the IQ tests, as in populations, have increased the IQ score throughout generations. So one more time, is that it's not like you just stay in one place. With the years, probably also the questions changed, but I believe there was still one study with these same questions, and it was like, as in later generations could score higher. Progressives in each era began with a preconception, and when they found evidence that fit this preconception, then they saw it as the perfect evidence to show that they were in the right. But when you want to know the truth, you have to keep going and to ask questions about it, to see if you can find evidence that will go against your initial results. And not only they don't do it, but when others do it and they present it, then they are attacked and people want them to be silent. These crusaders weren't ill-educated nor part of the low class. They were actually well-educated. They were intellectuals, and there was a similar phenomenon in the United States and in England, because in this latter one they even had eugenics society at the Cambridge University. Most of these intellectuals were on the political left. Of course, there were also some conservatives like Winston Churchill and Neville Chamberlain. Now, in order to keep adding these factors to the IQ test, is that white people living in the Hebrides Island of Scotland and white people living in the canal boat communities in Britain, they had similar IQ to the black ones. And this was due, to the black ones in the United States, and this was due to the geographical and social isolation. More factors keep coming in against this genetic determinism. Carl Brigham was one of the ones that was using the IQ tests as evidence to show that the Jews weren't as intelligent as everyone thought they were. However, one factor to take in consideration is that these Jews didn't speak English that well at the time, and it was when they started using English in their households, then their IQ test scores improved and they were actually above average. Because I don't know why language wasn't taken in consideration to do these tests, but again, it's just people that just have preconceptions that they want to prove as the absolute evidence. Sowell asks, like, what can happen when an idea or a vision becomes a heady dogma? And I mentioned before that one of the main dangers is the freedom against the individual, which later can become against the society.